It may come as something of a surprise to hear spiritual formation and daily work put together into the same sentence. You understandably hope your work will change the world for the better, and you probably pray that God will use you in your work as salt and light in the lives of coworkers and clients and so on. Now, it's true, God can and does use your work to bring about transformation in the world and in people. But for the next several minutes, let me suggest how one of God's major purposes in your work is to change you. Sometimes spiritual formation takes on a kind of churchy, stained glass aura. After all, isn't spiritual formation what our church gatherings on Sundays are supposed to be all about? Conventional wisdom can easily see spiritual growth as taking place mostly through sermons, Bible studies, prayer meetings, and so on. But let's take a closer look. From the outset of his dealings with Israel, God made it clear that work was to occupy a major part of our waking hours. In Exodus 20, verse 9, God said, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. His instructions said to work 6 days out of 7. Nothing in the New Testament changes that original assignment to work on an essentially daily basis. However, the New Testament does tell us something else that we're to do daily. It says, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Luke 9:23. Taking up our cross, following Jesus, I think you'll agree that both of these lie at the very heart of spiritual formation. But we're told that each of these is to take place daily. Now, if 85% of our days are to be spent working, then the overwhelming majority of our bearing the cross and following Jesus, our spiritual formation, will need to take place in the context of our work. Perhaps that's what led Eugene Peterson to write these words. I'm prepared to contend that the primary location for spiritual formation is the workplace. Notice that Peterson does not say a primary location. Instead, he names the workplace as the primary location for spiritual formation. Does that sound like an overstatement? Well, let's think it through. What is it about our workplaces that makes them such ideal incubators for spiritual growth? For one thing, our daily work, paid or unpaid, probably confronts us with perhaps most of our challenges, stresses, and tests. A great many of these come at us through other people. Coworkers don't always agree with us. Some of them can get downright hostile and even toxic. They break agreements. They misrepresent what we have said. They shirk their own work in ways that make our work far harder. Not only that, but the work itself can be frustrating. Computer hard drives crash, cars break down, crops fail. Weather makes it impossible to meet deadlines, and all these and more are the extended version of the thorns, the thistles, the sweat, and the pain that came when God cursed the ground after our foreparents opened the door of the work world to sin. Further, our work places us in a jet stream of temptations. Perhaps more than anywhere else, the workplace confronts us with those major enticements of money and sex and power. Pursuing a legitimate profit can morph into greed. Coworkers, customers, clients can entice or harass sexually. A desire for greater responsibility can turn into a selfish ambition for power. If we as Christians are to overcome these people problems, these work issues, and these temptations, it'll require that we do so by taking up our cross, by saying, "Not my will, but yours be done," in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus actually took up his cross before the Romans put him on the wooden one. Following Jesus means taking up our crosses and dying to self-centered aims. Again and again, and again, day in, day out, week in, week out, year in, year out, and if we consistently practice that in our daily work, what Eugene Peterson called a long obedience in the same direction, we will discover that God has used all this in the process of forming Christ in us. I experienced that shortly after going to work as an information officer for the state of Washington back in 1966. As the young editor of the official magazine for the Washington State Highways Department, I had a whole lot of creative ideas for stories, things that I thought were just great. In the beginning, I'd head into my boss's office and I'd say, "Bill, I've got this great idea for an article in our next issue of the magazine." But time after time, Bill would shoot my wonderful ideas down, and after 20 or so times, I saw that this pattern was not going to change. So after a year or so, utterly frustrated, I began designing my own parachute out of my state job. Except that deep down, I sensed that God was not pleased with my exit strategy. I continued to kick against the goads for a while. Eventually, the pressure became so great, I caved. I went to my little home office, stretched flat out on the floor before God, and began to pour out my heart. I surrendered my plans for leaving the state, my house, my car, my wife, my kids, and the job, the whole 9 yards. Although I did not know what to call it back then, later I realized that something in me had to die. In short, I had taken up my cross to follow Jesus on my job. I ended up remaining another 10 years working for the state. Also much later, I discovered that God had used workplaces in spiritual formation way back in Bible days. Let's look at 2 examples. In David's first job, he served as a sheep herder for his father Jesse. Spending all day in fields far away from the hustle and bustle of any city may seem to us like fairly stress-free work. But from time to time, David had to deal with wild animals bent on having mutton for dinner. One day, his dad gave him a break from his daily chores. David's older brothers were off fighting against the Philistines with King Saul. Wanting news about his boys, Jesse sent David to the battlefront with bread and cheese and asked that his youngest son bring back a news report, basically, on how they were doing. David arrived while a 9-foot giant, Goliath, was striking terror into the hearts of the whole Israelite army. Appalled that this ungodly pagan was defying the army of the true God, David told King Saul that he would go and fight him. "You're only a boy," the king said. But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep, and when a lion or bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Of course, we all know what happened next. But think about the spiritual formation that David had experienced in the workplace and how that prepared him to take on the giant. His daily work with the sheep had brought him up against terrifying circumstances. When the lion came, he must have been tempted to run for his life. When the bear came, with its powerful jaws and claws, David's adrenaline undoubtedly kicked in. But in each case, he trusted God to intervene, and God did. Now, because of spiritual formation that had taken place on the job, David was ready to trust God to see him through an even larger challenge. Nehemiah's workplace was the winter palace of the Persian king Artaxerxes. His job involved serving wine at the king's table. Normally, he did so with a smile. But after receiving news of the broken down wall of Jerusalem, he came to his task with a sad face. This surprised the king, who asked what was troubling him. Knowing what the displeasure of a boss, was a king, could mean, Nehemiah was, in his words, very much afraid. But he explained how his ancestral city was in ruins. "What is it you want?" asked the king. After a quick arrow prayer, Nehemiah answered, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my fathers are buried, so that I can rebuild it." Much to his relief, the king agreed to this request and others. Here again, the workplace became the location of spiritual formation for Nehemiah. He had seen God intervene. Now he could trust God for the great work of rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem. A while ago, I did a video interview with a friend named Rod Romberger. He too experienced spiritual formation on the job. Here is that interview. With me today is Rod Romberger, and I've asked Rod to tell us about an occasion in which he was able to continue communing with God even on a very difficult workday. Tell us, Rod, who were you working for and what was your role?
Well, at the time I was working for a major telecommunications industry, and I was a manager in one of the transportation departments where I was supervising over 40 people. When I first started in that department in 1981, I had a crew of about 20, and we got along really well and had good rapport and so forth. And then I was asked to temporarily take over, another crew, which all of a sudden now my head count was 41 people. And working 24-hour type shifts, the graveyard shift, mid shift, and then the morning shift. So I always had people, on the road doing jobs and stuff, different times of the day and night. I had a real good rapport, like I said, with my original crew, but for some reason the second crew, they had some bitterness and some things that had gone wrong in their part of the organization, and so when I came on board, they looked at me as more of an enemy than as a friend. After about a period of over 2 years, which seemed like eternity, I was getting calls in the middle of the night from some of the employees that were just doing it to harass me, and knowing fully well that I was, asleep, and they were asking me questions that I really could have answered later on in that during the day. And also I was, unfortunately, I had gone through a divorce during that time, and so I had the stresses of that and along with the workplace. And so it got so much that one day I just at my desk in front of everyone, not really caring, about, what people thought, I just bowed my head and asked God to take the burden.
And what happened then?
Immediately, it was an experience that it's very hard to describe, but the burden was immediately lifted. I felt this warmth around me, and it was like, for a moment, my hearing, I lost all sense of what was going around me, and I was just hearing this calm voice, and it was just a burden that was lifted, and I got up from the desk, and I knew that I needed to make a decision to get out of management and go back to the regular workforce.
What did this experience teach you about God's interest in our daily work?
That He's there with us 24/7, whether we realize it or not. And there were many people in the workplace there that were not Christians. And there were actually a couple of people that came up to me later, seeing the change in me. And I really believe that it probably helped perhaps maybe them accept Christ. Spiritual formation involves discipline, which is never easy. I wanted to leave my state job. No doubt Joseph wanted to leave Egypt and get back home. And I can imagine that Daniel would have preferred Jerusalem to the lion's den. As Christians, how often do we think of those difficult workplaces as the arenas for forming Christ in us? True, He may use our work to improve life on earth for plants, animals, or people. And we may be the instruments through which God works to draw others to Himself and to salvation through faith in Christ. But in addition to using your work to transform the world,
or to transform other people, how might God be intending to use your work in your own spiritual formation? Out of the writings of the Desert Fathers came this saying, "Keep to your cell, and your cell will teach you everything." How might God be intending to use your workplace, your cell, to transform you?